The wind howled like a wounded animal across the plains, lashing the small frontier town of Millstone with biting cold and clouds of dust. Above the sloped rooftops, dark clouds swirled like they had a grudge against the earth. Thunder cracked, low and menacing, warning of the storm to come. But inside the old wooden church, a different kind of tempest was brewing. James Harlow stood at the altar, hands clenched at his sides, sweat beading at his brow despite the chill. His clothes were clean but simple, his only suit patched carefully at the elbow by his mother. His boots were scrubbed, though years of labor had worn them thin. He'd shaved that morning, his jawline scraped raw in places from a dull blade. Still he looked proud. Nervous, yes, but proud. He was marrying the woman he loved, and no storm, earthly or otherwise, could unmake that joy. Outside, townsfolk filled the pews with the curious hush of anticipation. Most came not to celebrate, but to witness the spectacle. Clara Winthrop, daughter of the town's wealthiest merchant, was marrying a laborer, a man who worked with his hands, who dug trenches and hauled stone while the gentry dined behind velvet curtains. James glanced out toward the aisle. The organ remained silent. No footsteps, no veil, just the soft murmur of whispers beginning to rise, like the rustle of dry leaves before a fire catches. Behind him, the priest cleared his throat and leaned in. "James," he whispered gently. "It's been nearly an hour." James didn't answer. He just stared at the heavy doors. Then they opened. But it wasn't Clara. It was Thomas Winthrop, tall, silver-haired, and furious, his long coat dripping rainwater onto the church floor. Behind him stood Clara, her arm held firm in her father's grip, her face pale. Her lips trembled, but no words came from them. Thomas marched forward, his boots echoing loud over the wooden floor, until he stood just a foot from James. "This farce ends now." James blinked. "Sir, she's not marrying a dirt-covered ditch digger," Thomas spat. "You think a few stolen glances in the market make you a worthy man? You've no name, no legacy, no land. She loves me. She doesn't know what love is. And you're not going to teach her." James looked past him at Clara. She wouldn't meet his gaze. Her shoulders were shaking, whether from tears or fear, he couldn't tell. He took a step forward. "Clara." Her eyes finally lifted. For a moment, just one, they were filled with something close to sorrow. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She looked away and said nothing. Thomas raised a hand. "You will not disgrace my family further." He turned to the priest. "This wedding is over." James stood rooted to the altar as if struck by lightning. He didn't move. Couldn't. Clara turned then, her father pulling her gently but firmly back down the aisle. No music, no goodbye. Just the sharp click of heels and boots retreating into the cold. Whispers erupted in their wake, each word a dagger. Should have known. Thought he could marry up. Foolish dreamer. James stayed still. Long after the church emptied, the priest touched his shoulder gently, but he didn't speak. Eventually he was alone. Outside, rain began to pour in sheets, pounding against the earth like it meant to drown the town. James stepped into it, his body numb. His mother waited by the fence, a shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her hands, calloused and worn, reached out. She said nothing of the ceremony, no soft lies, no comforting reassurances. Only, "Come home, son, you're freezing." But he didn't follow. Instead, James turned and walked down the road past the bakery, the mill, and the general store where he'd once caught Clara's eye, past the ridicule in strangers' eyes, past the girl he'd once loved, and the future that would never be. He didn't stop walking. As night fell, he reached the outskirts of town and crossed into the woods beyond. The storm chased him through the trees, snapping branches and soaking his clothes through to the skin. But he didn't turn back. He built a fire under a rocky overhang using dry moss and stubborn twigs. It took an hour, but he managed, his hands working by instinct. The flames flickered low but enough to dry the worst of the wet from his shirt. He huddled beside it, the crackling wood the only sound for miles. Above, thunder still groaned. He thought of Clara, her eyes when they met his, the way she used to laugh behind the counters, brushing flour from her cheek. That laugh felt like another lifetime now. What was he really? A worker, a nobody. He'd tried to believe in something bigger than his station, tried to climb too high, and the world reminded him what happens when men reach for more than their hands can hold. Fire hissed as more rain splashed in. He didn't care. He would not return to Millstone, let them whisper, let them forget. He would disappear into the land, make something for himself with hands that built rather than begged. A man could survive out here. Maybe not thrive, not yet, but survive. That night James carved his name into a piece of bark with a blunt knife. Just his first name, a reminder. He was still here, still breathing. In the weeks that followed, he walked farther west into the thickets and canyons most settlers feared. The air grew colder, food scarcer. Twice he woke to find coyotes circling his camp. Once, he stepped wrong on a hillside and twisted his ankle badly, limping for days. The wilderness didn't care about class or name. It only asked if you could endure. James answered in silence. He trapped rabbits, learned to boil roots that didn't poison, caught rain in his palms. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached every night, but something strange happened with each mile further from Millstone. He felt lighter. He missed no one. He owed nothing. He dreamed not of Clara anymore, but of building a home with his own hands. Something small, strong, carved into the bones of the earth. A place no one could take from him. He kept walking. Then, one night, as he crouched near a creek cleaning a fresh kill, he heard it, a low rustle not 10 feet away. He froze, his knife raised, his breath shallow. Nothing. Silence stretched thin and taut then. Crack. A twig snapped. James turned fast, eyes scanning the tree line. There. A shadow. Watching. Not an animal. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, half hidden by brush. His beard was dark and unkempt. His eyes glinted from beneath a slouched hat. James raised the knife. You lost? No answer. Don't mean you harm, James said carefully. Just hunting. The man tilted his head, then disappeared into the dark. James didn't sleep that night. Something had shifted. The land wasn't empty. The next morning, his snares were empty. Every one of them. But tied to the final trap was a piece of raw meat, fresh, and beside it a clean, sharpened knife. James picked it up, examining the blade. Whoever this stranger was, they'd seen something in him worth helping. He didn't know it then, but he was no longer alone. The wilderness had begun to answer. And it wasn't through kindness. It was through testing, breaking, rebuilding. And somewhere out there, watching from the trees, was a man who would help define the path ahead. A figure wrapped in mystery and shadow whose silent aid was just the beginning. James sheathed the knife, then stood and walked on. He didn't know where yet, but he wasn't turning back. The river ran wild beneath a winter-gray sky, swollen with melted snow from distant mountains. James crouched at the bank's edge, cupping water in his palms. It was bitter cold, sharp enough to sting the cracks in his fingers. His hands were raw from days of carving, lifting, and stitching the torn leather of his boots with dried sinew. The forest had taken much, but it had yet to take him. His stomach gnawed constantly, an ever-present reminder of the hunger that threaded through every waking hour. Still, he moved forward, driven not by hope, but by a quiet refusal to surrender. 2 days ago, he'd caught a wild hen using a loop snare, only for a fox to steal it before he could return. Nature didn't pity the slow. It didn't reward effort. It demanded everything. And if you failed to offer enough, it simply erased you. James stood slowly, scanning the trees. There were prints in the mud beside his own, human prints, half-faded, leading up from the south. They weren't there, the Night before. He wasn't alone, and he hadn't been for a while. Whoever was out there wasn't careless. The footprints vanished a few paces in, hidden cleverly beneath broken brush and dry moss. A skilled traveler. Perhaps even a hunter. That night, he built his fire lower, the flame subdued by careful layering of wet leaves above the pit. He didn't sleep deeply anymore. Dreams had given way to instincts, and his instincts screamed, "Watch." The figure returned at dawn. James had been preparing to skin a rabbit caught at dusk. He sat back on his haunches and heard it, barely a crunch underfoot that no animal could make. He didn't turn, just waited. The silence stretched, thick as tree bark. Then from the trees, the stranger emerged. He looked carved from the wilderness itself. Broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and eyes like steel hammered cold. He wore no badge, no coat of authority. Only layers of rough canvas and thick wool, each one patched and darkened by weather and blood. Over his shoulder hung a battered, long rifle, its wood scarred deep. The man didn't speak. He crouched across from James and stared at the rabbit. Slowly, he withdrew a knife from his belt and tossed it across the fire. James caught it in the dirt. The blade gleamed with a clean edge far superior to the jagged thing he'd been hacking with for days. James looked up. "You been following me?" The man said nothing, just took out a hunk of smoked meat from his satchel, tore a piece, and tossed the rest toward James. It landed beside the rabbit. The meat smelled faintly of pepper and oak smoke. James hesitated, then nodded once and took it. They ate in silence. For the first time in weeks, the knot in James's gut eased. It wasn't comfort, it was observation. The man across from him, for all his silence, was evaluating, weighing. Not in the way a banker measured worth, but the way predators judged prey, or partners. Later that day, James found his snares retied with improved knots. Not the kind you learned from books, but hard-earned tricks passed from one survivor to another. A silent lesson, no words needed. He began following the man's lead, at a distance at first. The stranger didn't speak, but he didn't discourage it either. When James faltered, he'd leave small clues. A tree limb bent to point north, a stone shaped like an arrow placed by a trail. At first, James thought it was coincidence. Then he realized it was invitation. He learned without asking. How to strip bark for fire starter. How to walk without leaving a trail. How to read the birds. When their silence meant something darker, lurked near. Still, the man never gave his name. Days passed, then a week. Finally, by a smoky campfire under a canopy of whispering pines, James asked, "You got a name?" The man looked at him for a long time, then muttered, "Silas." Nothing more. James nodded, like that was enough. And it was. Silas spoke rarely, but his silence was purposeful, not cold. His eyes carried stories, losses probably, though James didn't press. One night, after a hunt that ended with a near-deadly slip down a ravine, Silas handed James a flask. Inside wasn't liquor, but hot bone broth, earthy and life-giving. That night, James slept deeper than he had since leaving Millstone. When he woke, Silas had drawn a rough map in the dirt, a trail leading west past the jagged cliffs and into a new valley. At its center was a mark, an X. "What's there?" James asked. Silas scraped a line beside it with his boot. "Fairborn." "Town?" "Not exactly." James waited. Silas finally added, "It's where people go when there's nowhere else to go." That evening, they traveled together, no longer pretending otherwise. The landscape grew harder, steeper, ridges, dense pine thickets, the kind of place even trappers avoided. The further they walked, the more James sensed a shift, not just in the land, but in himself. He was stronger now, not just in muscle, but in resolve. He didn't crave comfort. He craved purpose. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley by dusk 3 days later. Smoke curled from distant chimneys below, maybe half a dozen structures rough-hewn and sturdy. Fences wound through patches of dark soil, freshly tilled, and at the heart of it all stood a manor-like building, built from deep-stained timber, and dark stone looming yet beautiful. It didn't match the rest, it had elegance, precision. James frowned. That doesn't look like a place for the lost. Silas didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It's a place built by someone who lost everything." As they descended into the valley, James's heart beat faster. This was no random homestead. This was a hidden sanctuary. But what kind? And for who? They reached the front path of the manor by nightfall. Torches flickered at the corners. A single guard stood outside, not in uniform, but with the casual readiness of a man who'd seen real war. He nodded once at Silas and opened the door. The interior was warm, not just in temperature but in texture. Wood-paneled walls, shelves lined with books and maps. At the end of the hall, beside a long table, stood a woman. She turned slowly, revealing a face not adorned by jewels or makeup, but shaped by grit and experience. Late 20s, perhaps. Her hair pinned back, boots caked with dust, yet her posture was regal. "Silas," she said, voice steady. "And you've brought someone." James stepped forward, unsure what to say. The woman studied him, eyes sharp and assessing. "What's your name?" she asked. "James Harlow, ma'am." She tilted her head. "You've been out there long. I can see it in your hands." James lowered his gaze. "Got nowhere else to be." She smiled faintly, not out of pity but recognition. "Neither did I." Silas nodded once and stepped back. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Eleanor Fairborn. Welcome." James didn't know what he'd walked into, not fully, but something told him he'd reached a turning point. This wasn't just refuge, it was a place where scars were currency and survival was proof of worth. Eleanor studied him a moment longer. "Let's see what you can do," she said. "Out here no one cares where you came from, only whether you'll bleed for something greater." James nodded, silently accepting the challenge. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't running, he was beginning. Morning in Fairborn broke with the scent of damp pine and wood smoke. The mist lingered low across the valley like an old secret refusing to lift. James stood in the training yard, shirt clinging to his back, breath clouding in the chill. A makeshift dummy, carved from hay and scraps of cloth, swayed before him, its center marked with a red X. He tightened his grip on the wooden practice sword Silas had handed him at dawn. His arms ached. His ribs still bore bruises from the day before, yet his eyes held the kind of fire that wouldn't be easily doused. From the edge of the yard, Eleanor watched. She leaned against the post, arms crossed, a faint line between her brows as she studied his form. "Again!" she called, not raising her voice but filling the space with authority. James stepped forward and swung. The blade struck too high, barely grazing the mark. "Wider stance," came Silas's gravelly voice from behind. "Use your hips, not your shoulders." James reset, exhaled slow, then struck again. This time the sound was sharper, more deliberate. He stepped back, sweat sliding down his temples. Eleanor approached, her boots silent in the dirt. She circled him like a hawk. "You've never held a weapon before, Fairborn." "No, ma'am, but you've fought." He hesitated. "With fists, words, life." She nodded once. "That's enough. For now." Each day in Fairborn blurred into grueling repetition. Chopping wood, forging tools, practicing weapons, mapping routes, hunting, building. The compound was a place of purpose, not comfort. Everyone who stayed had a task, and Eleanor, though young, commanded respect without demanding it. She had built Fairborn from nothing after her family was slaughtered during a raid 3 winters ago. The manor had once belonged to a government man, now long dead, reclaimed by Eleanor and those who followed her. She'd turned grief into mission, forging a sanctuary for the discarded, the broken, the misjudged. But it was no refuge for the weak. You earned your place or you left. James had started as a laborer, hauling lumber, patching fences, cleaning stables. Slowly, Silas brought him deeper into the compound's trust. Weapon drills, strategy discussions, watch shifts on the northern ridge, where sightings of bandits had grown more frequent. In return, James asked for nothing. He worked until his hands bled, until his lungs burned from cold air, and until his mind quieted from the ghosts of Millstone. Clara's face no longer visited him at night, not often. When it did, it arrived softer now, distant. He no longer mourned her loss. He mourned the illusion, the belief that love alone could shield a man from the truth of class, power, and the cruelty of pride. He forged new bonds in Fairborn, not with words but through sweat, hardship, and quiet trust. There was Nora, a former medic who rarely spoke unless stitching wounds. Eli, a blacksmith who sang hymns to himself while pounding iron. Even the children, orphans taken in during the famine, gravitated toward James. He carved toys for them from scrap wood in the late hours, eyes tired but hands steady. But still, it was Silas who remained closest. Not as a friend, not quite as a mentor, but as something between the two. A mirror, perhaps, of who James could become. One evening, James and Silas sat outside the East Watchtower, sharing jerky and passing a canteen of water. "Why me?" James finally asked. Silas didn't answer right away. Then, without turning, he muttered, "Because you didn't break." James thought on that. In the world he left behind, silence was failure. Here, it was strength. A week later, scouts returned with grim news. A band of raiders had taken hold of a nearby settlement, Red Hollow, killing the leaders, enslaving the workers, and fortifying the land. They were moving south, toward Fairborn. Eleanor called a council. They met in the hall's lower chamber, where maps lined the walls and lantern light cast long shadows across determined faces. "They have numbers," said Eli, leaning over the table. "And they're ruthless. I saw the fire from 2 miles out." Eleanor nodded. "Which means they'll move quickly, overconfident." "We need to prepare," Silas added. "Watch points, traps, scouting patrols." James stepped forward. "Let me lead one." Eyes turned to him. He didn't flinch. "You've never fought a real battle," said Eli. "I've survived worse." Eleanor held his gaze. "Why do you want this, James?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I owe this place more than labor. I came here with nothing. You gave me a reason to build again. If they're coming to take that away, they'll have to go through me." She considered him for a moment longer, then nodded. "You leave at first light." The mission was simple: observe, report, avoid conflict. But in the wild, simplicity never survived first contact. James and 2 others, Luca, a young tracker, and Merritt, a wiry sharpshooter, moved out before dawn. They crossed frost-hardened fields, crept through thick brush, and scaled rocky hills to get a vantage over Red Hollow. What they saw chilled the blood. Smoke still rose from collapsed rooftops. Men with scarred faces and mismatched armor patrolled the ruins. At the center, a flag bearing the symbol of a black snake was hoisted, high, the mark of Cassian Drell, a former trade tycoon turned warlord who ruled by fear and gold. James cursed under his breath. They watched from the ridge until sunset, then slipped away unnoticed, or so they thought. But 2 miles east, near a broken ravine, the ambush struck. Arrows hissed through the trees. Merritt fell first, a cry choked off mid-breath. Luca turned to run, only to be tackled by a massive figure clad in dark leather. James spun, drew his blade, and lunged, barely dodging a spear thrust aimed for his ribs. He rolled, came up behind his attacker, and drove the blade deep into the man's side. Blood spurted, the body fell. He grabbed Luca, half dragging him into the underbrush. Behind them, the enemy didn't pursue. Not far. It wasn't a slaughter. They had been testing Fairborn's reach. They returned battered, bruised and bleeding, but alive. Eleanor stood waiting at the gate. She said nothing as James recounted everything, his voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You fought like someone who's lost enough," she said. James nodded. "And someone who's ready to protect what he's found." The days that followed were a storm of preparation. Defenses reinforced, tunnels dug, silent signals created. Fairborn would not run. They would not bow. They would stand. James no longer felt like the laborer who'd been abandoned at an altar. He was something more. And the warlord, Cassian Drell, would soon learn that not every man who toiled in the dirt stayed beneath it. Some rose, forged by flame, ready to defy the very world that once tried to bury them. The night before the assault was quiet, eerily so. Fairborn sat cloaked in silence, its lanterns extinguished, its breath held. Every able body lay in wait, tucked behind trees, within ditches, beneath carefully laid brush. Traps had been set, lines drawn, signals arranged with the precision of those who knew the value of every heartbeat. Rain threatened overhead, heavy clouds churning as if the heavens themselves were preparing for bloodshed. James knelt in the mud near the outer ridge, his blade strapped to his side, bow slung across his back. His muscles were taut, but his mind was clear. He was no longer the man who begged for scraps or prayed to be seen. He knew his place now, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone ready to defend what he'd earned. Beside him, Silas shifted silently, his fingers resting over the hilt of his long knife. The old scout had barely spoken since the failed recon mission, but James understood. Silence now was faith. In the plan. In each other. From the northern slope came a flicker, 3 quick flashes of reflected light. The signal, "They're coming." James exhaled slowly, drawing the breath deep into his belly to still his pulse. Across the narrow ravine lay the main approach, exposed and steep. No man could charge it without being a target. But that's what Cassian Drell's men intended. Brute force, overwhelming numbers, reckless confidence. That's how warlords thought. That's how they fell. The first wave appeared just past midnight. 20 men armed to the teeth, their torches low and voices hushed. They moved with the entitlement of predators. They expected to storm a frightened commune, not an armed stronghold. They never saw the tripwire. With a snap, the line released a cluster of weighted logs, sending 3 of them tumbling into the ravine. Panic rippled through the line. Shouts rose. That's when the arrows began. From hidden ledges, Fairborn's archers released a barrage. James loosed 3 arrows in quick succession, each finding its mark. Silas moved like a phantom, slipping through brush to strike from behind, never lingering in the same place twice. Screams echoed. Chaos erupted, but the second wave was smarter. They flanked wide, trying to encircle the defenders. James turned to sprint toward the western rise, only to be met by 2 soldiers crashing through the undergrowth. One lunged, blade arcing. James ducked, driving his shoulder into the man's gut, then rolled, coming up with a slash that opened the second man's thigh. Blood sprayed. Another blow, instinctual, brutal, ended it. He didn't stop to breathe. He ran. By the time he reached the rise, the defenders were staggering. Eli fought like a mad bull, his hammer cracking bones. Nora had taken an arrow to the shoulder, but still fired her pistol with calm fury. The enemy pressed hard, assuming they'd broken the line. But Eleanor hadn't shown her hand yet. From the manor came the roar of thunder, not from the sky, but from the black powder charges set beneath the forward fence. With a tremor, a wall, a fire erupted, cutting off the final wave of Drell's troops. Flames lit the valley, casting hellish light across the battlefield. Then she stepped forward. Eleanor Fairborn, dressed in dark leather armor, eyes fierce and unwavering, walked through the smoke with a long rifle resting on her hip. She did not speak. She didn't have to. Her people rallied to her like iron to a lodestone. James watched her stride forward, fearless as bullets whizzed past. She fired once, dropping a man charging the front line, then another. Precision. Cold resolve. The enemies hesitated. This was no leader hiding behind her walls. This was a commander who bled with her people. James joined her, sword drawn. Together they pushed forward, forcing the invaders into retreat. But then came the storm's heart. Cassian Drell himself emerged from the tree line on horseback, flanked by 5 of his fiercest guards. He was larger than expected, broad, armored in black studded leather, a cruel scar across his jaw. His voice boomed across the battlefield. "Who commands this pile of mud?" Eleanor stepped ahead of James and raised her chin. "I do," Drell sneered. "A woman? You'll die slow for this." She didn't blink. "You should have brought more men." Drell dismounted, tossing aside his cloak. He drew a curved blade gleaming red in the firelight. His guards spread out, advancing. James stepped beside Eleanor. "You shouldn't face him alone." "I won't," she said, and nodded toward the ridge. Silas emerged with 2 more fighters cutting off the guard's flank. It happened fast. Like lightning, James met the nearest soldier head-on, deflecting his spear, spinning to his left, and slamming his elbow into the man's temple. Eleanor fired her last round at point-blank range, dropping one of the guards. Silas moved like death itself, silent and unstoppable, cutting down 2 more before they turned. Then only Cassian remained. He and Eleanor circled one another, blades raised, tension crackling. He struck first, wild and heavy. She ducked, sidestepped, slashed his arm. He howled and swung again, knocking her backward. James lunged forward, but Eleanor held up a hand. "No!" She charged. Their blades clashed, metal screaming. Eleanor's technique was sharp, clean, born from discipline, not rage. Drell, stronger but slower, underestimated her precision. She ducked low, rolled, and came up behind him, driving her blade into the back of his knee. He collapsed with a roar. "You think you're above us?" He spat, blood on his teeth. "You're nothing but dirt." Eleanor stood over him. "And you never knew how strong the soil can grow." Then she drove her blade into his heart. Silence fell. The fire burned low. The enemy was scattered. Those who hadn't fled surrendered. The wounded were tended. The fallen were honored. And Fairborn stood, scarred but unbroken. James sat beside the outer wall by dawn, cleaning his blade with trembling hands. Across, from him Eleanor wrapped her shoulder in cloth. Their eyes met. No words passed. They didn't need any. Later that day, as the storm clouds cleared, the valley lit with golden light. Survivors wandered from hiding, families who'd escaped Red Hollow, wanderers drawn by the rumor of resistance. Fairborn would grow, not just in numbers but in meaning. James found himself by the children again, helping repair a broken cart. A little boy covered in soot looked up at him. "Were you scared?" James nodded. "Yes. But that's how you know it mattered." He turned toward the manor, where Eleanor stood speaking to newcomers. He saw Silas resting by a tree, his head tipped back, eyes closed for the first time in weeks. And for the first time in a long time, James felt something stir that had been missing. Peace, edged with purpose. He wasn't a rejected groom. He wasn't just a laborer. He was a protector, a builder, a man reborn. Fairborn wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real, earned, worth fighting for. And James would fight again if needed. Because sometimes, being rejected by the world is exactly how you find where you truly belong. Voice softens as music swells. If you felt something in this story, if you saw yourself in James or Eleanor, or even in the grit it takes to start again, leave a comment. Share it. Let others feel it too. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Because the stories worth hearing are the ones that remind us who we are and what we can still become.